Welcome back to the Brothers Mahoney. This is Michael.
And I am James.
And today we're discussing The Roses, which is a brief encounter which was published in Doctor Who magazine 214, which came out back in June 1994. And James will explain a little bit about what the brief encounters were, but this is essentially just an ultra short story, and this was written by a Robert Mammone. And there's also an illustration, just a single illustration in the story, which was apparently drawn by a Brian Hudd, who did a couple of other illustrations for some other Doctor Who short stories, so thought we should reference him also.
He also might have been the one who did the illustration for the title of the story as well.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
But as Michael had mentioned, this is a brief encounter. Now, what these were, and these are a very random piece of Doctor Who history, these touted being published in Doctor Who magazine around the same time as the Voyages in New Adventures were being published, the VNAs, starring the Seventh Doctor. And these were short stories, very short, one page, sometimes 2 pages, it happened, of just these small encounters. Sometimes the Doctor themselves never even appeared in the story, and it was just someone else in the Doctor Who universe. These were published in between 1991 and 1994. This, in fact, is the last published brief encounter, which is somewhat ironic that it's the first one we're covering. But hey, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly, we must be 6 according to Belinda.
Why am I a child?
Exactly. That was still pretty funny. But nonetheless, these usually had the Doctor, if the Doctor's a pain, maybe meet a companion out of order, meet a companion way later in their life, after they're done with their travels and adventures. Maybe it had them meet somebody who had been a victim in a story that had happened, just seeing how they were doing. I know there's a rather touching one where Ace visits the girl who is used as a Dalek puppet during Remembrance of the Daleks. It was a very well done, just short little story. And that's basically what you can expect from a lot of these. I know there's one where the Seventh Doctor and Ace run into Dagon from City of Death, the, of course, famous Douglas Adams Fourth Doctor story. And there's all types of things of that nature. These were published not only in Doctor Who magazine at the time, like I said, the early to mid-90s, they were also published in those spin-off things, the Winter Specials, the early yearbooks they published. I believe there's one from 91 through 96, maybe 95. And they had stopped making brief encounters by 95. But nonetheless, I think there are around 5 of those yearbooks during this era. And I think it's just a very interesting way to tell a story. It's not a long-form story by any means, but you can still pack a lot into these pages, 1 or 2 pages, if you're a good writer, and I suppose that's part of the challenge writing one of these. As for this one, for example, the plot is rather on the surface of it, a rather simple affair. This story, for the record, if you haven't stated before, is starring the First Doctor. As the Doctor walks through a vast rose garden, he contemplates his recent past and is agonized by the decisions he's been forced to make in his times of traveling.
So, yeah, the Doctor is pretty much just walking through this giant garden. In fact, I believe garden is even capitalized, so it's like an official title.
Yeah, it's called The Garden.
Yeah, and he's just looking at a bunch of rose bushes and just pondering and thinking. And that is fundamentally the whole story. Like James said, it can't be easy to write an exceptionally short piece of literature and still pack in some feeling and character into it. So I think this one did an exceptionally good job, especially when I can't help compare it to something like Doctor Who and the Horror of Cold Hill, which we talked about pretty recently, which was, I think, on the whole, when it came to characterization, perfectly well written. But this one, it just feels, based on the short prose that we see here, it just feels a lot more quote-unquote professional.
Yeah, of course, the main difference in that case being that one was a lot more pages than this one, and yet they did it, from our point of view anyway, nearly have the feeling that this one does in just 1 page. No, that might have something to do with the content of the story as well. That one had to do with space wolves attacking the Doctor and some random teachers in a school during a fog. This one, the most action we see is the Doctor clipping some out of a rose. So it's obviously not really comparable. This is focused solely on the Doctor pondering events. The companion he's traveling with right now, for the record, is Steven. And if you're more well versed in Doctor Who lore than I am, because I want to be able to place this story with that information, this is taking place, and we'll get you the timeline and more specifics later, but this is taking place in a period not too long after the Daleks' master plan, which, of course, the Doctor had a couple of companions during the story, but they ended up dying or leaving, and the only one he was left with after our side and done was Stephen. And the one right after this would be the massacre, where at the end of that, they pick up Dodo. So there's a small space for a story like this to take place, and all you need is a small space for a Doctor Who writer. They would take any advantage they can to tell a story with whatever companions they want, because there's usually always a chance to fit something in somewhere. But throughout this story, he's just thinking about what went on during the Daleks' master plan, because the whole Marvick Chin situation must have been a big deal, even the Gago reference Marvick Chin. And even though we haven't listened to it yet, Marvick Chin even gets name dropped during the Doctor singing portion from Doctor Who and the Pirates with Colin Baker. So Marvick Chin must have done some heinous shit. He has not been forgotten, even though that's a story that's literally mostly lost. At least the original episodes. But along with all of that, he's also just considering Stephen, his current companion, and his mind floats back to the High Gallifreyan word Okiter, which I'm probably pronouncing horribly, but surprise, I just speak a High Gallifreyan.
Yeah, it's sort of an awkward word and or name, but we'll actually have it up on the screen right here so you can see our unfortunate position. It's like Okiter. That's the best I can come up with, but it could be pronounced in I imagine any number of ways, but I'm not a linguistic type guy.
Nor am I, and that's just what I'm going to stick with. But that is apparently High Gallifreyan for Rose, which, according to the Doctor's thoughts, was her name. Her, as we see the train of thoughts continue, being Susan. This is one of the, and there were a couple of these stories, especially in the 80s and early 90s, that claimed that Susan wasn't the real name of the Doctor's granddaughter, that she instead had a different name, and they, of course, welcome to Doctor Who, were contradictory names given. This one happens to have her name be, in English anyway, Rose. So Rose Tyler wasn't not the first Rose the Doctor met, or did she be disappointed?
I do find that pretty interesting, though, because it's purely coincidental, but the fact that Rose goes on to be a future Doctor's companion. And this story, like we said, it came out in 1994. So this is before even the TV movie. I don't know, it just seems interesting to me that this reveals Susan's original name to be the equivalent to Rose. And later, Rose Tyler, of course, becomes a big part of the Doctor Who universe. Or shall we say the Who-universe?
We shall not say the Who-universe. I do not enjoy that label, and I will not be using it. But, I think it's interesting. One thing you note about these early ones is the same fate befell them that befell the TV comic era. The children's things, that TV action, TV comic, all of those things. We've discussed two of them previously, a second Doctor and a third Doctor one. And those were written to be more disposable than these brief encounters are, I would argue. Keep in mind, this was still published in the early 90s. Come 2 years, it might be hard to get your hands on a copy of these. Certainly by the time the 8th Doctor came along in 96, and then the rights to publish the Doctor Who novels went from Virgin to BBC, some of these older issues were hard to get a hand on just to read, for even to get context from. So whenever one of these brief encounters, or an old story, comic story usually of Doctor Who magazine like to discuss something such as lore, usually it just got retconned later because nobody was able to get their hands on these stories to see what was written before, and or they just ignored it because they didn't know they had previously been stated. If they did know, they just figured there was an old story no one else is going to see. So either way, my base is so covered. I'm sure most of it did happen maliciously like that, but it's always a possibility. Another one that comes to mind that also in fact has to do with Susan is Birth of a Renegade, which is published, I believe, in a Doctor Who's parcel in 1985. And that one had something to do with the fact that Susan isn't even the Doctor's granddaughter. And so you can imagine how that's not really been brought up since then.
I do think it's worth mentioning that, like James said, it's not malicious, but there's always a lot of this. I mean, three big examples come to mind. Actually, four big examples come to mind, and I'm sure I could think of more. But four quick ones. One, what is the Doctor's age? That gets quote unquote retconned. Seems like every other season. And to be fair, nowadays, I feel like it's a question that's virtually impossible to answer just because of his time in the, what is it, Confession Dial?
Yes, that
Yeah,
great time.
yeah, if that counts as actual quote unquote years of the Doctor's age, I really don't know. But my point being, even back in the time of Classic Who, there were quite a few contradictory lines, such as my favorite being Pertwee's Doctor, third Doctor implying that he's around 2,000 years old.
Yeah, that was always kind of strange.
Yeah, so I mean, we have the Doctor's age, we have the Doctor's quote unquote real name. I'm pretty sure a lot of people stuck to the idea that Theta Sigma, which of course is later turned out to be quote unquote a nickname, but what that was in Armageddon Factor, I think.
Yes, the last story of the Key to Time, season 16.
And just the other two quick ones. One, and I guess these sort of tie in, but in like the last couple of seasons of Doctor Who, Classic Who, I think it brought up in Serial Nemesis, where the Doctor was implied to be quote unquote something more than just a Time Lord. And then the 96 TV movie saying the Doctor is quote half human. So those are two things that you don't hear often about nowadays, and I think, and I imagine both have been explained and or retconned in various ways by various different people. But all of this is to say that this type of thing is almost commonplace, it's almost expected, to be honest. I mean, this series has been going on since 1963, and you have to imagine a lot of people got information from a lot of different places, so it's just fascinating to me how such a, I guess, simple beginning can spiral out of control like it did.
Yeah, especially when you having your hands in all types of buckets. With the Ava Manson TV comics toys that were some of the most disposable things you could possibly imagine, that seems so dubious that even arguments to fit them into continuity make no sense. But Doctor Who, at the end of the day, doesn't really have much of a canon. And that's almost the joys of the show can do all at once. But it's also almost a nightmare for somebody like me who finds things like canon extremely interesting. But nonetheless, this is just one of those stories. And for the record, well, we're not going to show a picture of the whole page during this video just in case the somehow gets flagged for copyright infringement. Literally, this entire story, if you go to the TARDIS wiki page for the story, Roses, there's a link to a blog post written from the blog of Robert Mammone. And on that blog post, he just shares a picture of the story, which is in fact where we got the story from, where we were able to read it from. So, copyright infringement or not, that's literally the writers giving the story online for free. So I'll go take a look at it. Like I said, it'll take you just 5 minutes to read. That's a very, to me, a very thoughtful, very somber story where the Doctor's trying to come to terms with not only the past of why he had to leave Gallifrey, but also where he had to leave Susan, or if you really were to call her that during this, Rose or Alcator.
Yeah, and back in the Eight Doctors, I referenced one of the lines that interested me, or at least stood out to me more, when it went into the Doctor, quote unquote, remembering his departure from Gallifrey. And this story has a couple of lines too that stood out to me. And as the Doctor's walking through the garden and he's thinking about Susan, it goes into this quote: "Memories of that time surfaced again, of the dark times when his world tottered on the edge of ruin, where the impotence of his own people had driven him to leave." And it doesn't go into any further detail, just the quote, "impotence of his own people drove him to leave." So there's a scene in the Eight Doctors where it showed him, I think, angrily storming out of a council meeting, and then shortly thereafter he left, and here he's just angry at the impotence of his own people. So again, based on these two accounts, we don't really know what happened. I have no idea if we know what happened, but I do think it's interesting. And I also thought this thought from the Doctor was fascinating too, and this is talking specifically about Susan. Quote, "I offered her a better life, a life far from manipulation, a life amongst the stars, where she could find herself and not be a pawn to the chapter." And the chapter, I imagine, would be, God, what's it? How's it pronounced?
Yeah, it's apparently that Predonian chapter. It was first mentioned in the Deadly Assassin, which kind of makes a lot of sense. It also had a lot to do, and this is not going to be a surprise, it was dealt with a lot in Longborough as well.
Yeah, on the upside though, this story does not mention anything about looms, so you're okay on that front.
Which is mostly something we know from a video we watched at one point on YouTube. Because while I think there might be a reprinting out at this point, maybe, I think there's talks about it last year. But yeah, we do not own the original copy of Longborough or indie copy. One day we shall, but that day is not today and it's not going to be tomorrow. While this does have looms, this does have the Doctor giving at the end basically the true reason for this quasi breakdown. Because at this point he's swinging his cane at the roses. He's been personifying the roses most of this story, where when a rose does agree with his slight chiding of Stephen, he just kind of huffs at it and then walks away, which sounds so much like the first Doctor. I can completely imagine the first Doctor as we saw him in the classic series doing everything in this story. William Houghton would have been great if they could just have filmed this. What's really bothering him is that he left Susan behind in the Dalek invasion of Earth. In a rather famous scene where he makes the speech, "One day I will return," and all of that stuff. And the exact realization he comes to is that I've left her on a barbaric world in a blind century to wait the death of the man she loves, referring, of course, to David, who gets name dropped in this story. And that's how the Doctor feels. That's at the end of the day, as nice as he was trying to give her the freedom, he feels like he's just doomed her to a life watching the people she cares about die. And that's a very interesting internal dilemma that the Doctor's going through. Now, he, of course, resolves it's the first Doctor. He's not going to have a realization in a rose garden and just be a changed man. He resolves that he won't go back and save her because it'll go against everything he believes in, which is freedom and choice. Maybe the Doctor's a libertarian. God, that's a terrible thought.
Yeah, and I think the line about how the Doctor is quote offering her about her life is largely justification on his part. I mean, he might not be wrong. That life back on Gallifrey might not be the most exciting. I will say that's one of the things I'm interested in exploring in, what was it, the first Unbound?
Yes, which would be our mortality, which, fun fact, this rose garden is mentioned in.
See, that's funny. But yeah, I imagine being a lifelong Time Lord living on Gallifrey would be, as a kid, say, boring AF. So I can understand the Doctor's desire to get Susan away from that. But it's also dragging a comparatively young and dependent individual. It's not like it's the smartest choice out there. I mean, the Doctor may have been right to do so, but I'm just saying that this, to me, seems like justification on the Doctor's part. And I do think it's interesting, giving a little bit of the Doctor's personal viewpoints on leaving Susan behind. Because like you said, she's just there left behind watching someone die, pretty much live infinitely, and yeah, that's how it goes. And yeah, without a TARDIS, Susan's pretty much stuck there. So yeah, you can understand why the Doctor, even this Doctor, is pretty much probably one of the most hard-hearted Doctors there is, maybe about the same one as Portwee's Doctor.
Yeah, in some ways, Portwee's Doctor comes, I think, closest to hard-heartedness, but in a way, a lot of the Doctors kind of have that trait. Even the fifth Doctor, as pleasant as he usually was, when it came to decisions he made those decisions.
Yeah, so I just think it's interesting that as arrogant and hard-hearted as the first Doctor sometimes is, you can see that he does feel some guilt, even though, like James said, at the end he sort of justifies it again. But you can still see that he feels some guilt over that decision, which I imagine is probably one of the most difficult decisions he's had to make since leaving Gallifrey.
And leaving the hand of Omega, but that's later.
You were at Lan.
Or earlier, depending on how you look at it. And speaking of earlier, we are about to get into the timeline section officially. As listeners know, the TARDIS Wiki has a personal timeline for each Doctor, including the extensive extended media, ranging from the comic books, comic strips, Big Finish and BBC audio, the multiple book ranges, and everything in between. Doctor Who canon, insofar as it actually has one, is a jumbled mess and has been forever. So I just like to see where the stories we're discussing fit into the universe as a whole, as continuity in the narrative timeline has always been of interest to me. Unless hinted at earlier, this one takes place in January times between the Daleks' master plan and the massacre. The massacre, of course, being the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve. And I've heard both being called the official name. I've always mostly stuck with the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, but that is more of a mouthful. More specifically, however, right before this story is a big Finnish audio story from the Companion Chronicles, the first wave. This was the 5th story of the 6th series of the Companion Chronicles, and it was released November 2011 with companions Stephen and someone named Oliver, who I do not know in the slightest, but apparently he traveled with the first Doctor. So I guess in 20 years when we get to listening to the first wave, we'll figure out who Oliver is. Right after this is kind of hinted at or implied, I'm not sure the exact term, in the very last sentence of this story, that last sentence being, and behind him, tumbling hand over hand, a black pyramid rose over the horizon. That black pyramid being the trap that catches the first Doctor and leads into the 5 Doctors, which on the TARDIS Wiki timeline, this takes place right before for the first Doctor. He was just enjoying his little walk through his rose garden, which is a very beautiful contemplative spot, and this scary black pyramid just hunts him down and takes him into the 5 Doctors. So it's that friendly. It's such a pity Stephen wasn't in the 5 Doctors. That would have been kind of hilarious to see a companion like him among all these much more famous companions, relatively speaking.
I would just feel bad though when the 5th Doctor's like, I don't know who you are. I'm sorry, I've forgotten. And the sort of pleasant personality he has.
Yeah, that would have been rather sad, but
Hashtag awkward, as the kids say.
Hashtag they have Peter Pulves, the actor for Stephen, still doing big fitness, maybe even today. I don't know when the last one they did was with him.
That is long hashtag.
It is a long hashtag, but it's interesting that the actor for Stephen is still involved in Doctor Who. At least was as late as, I think, 5 years ago. Like I said, I don't know what the last one he's done so far is.
Yeah, and I think this story, even though it's quite simple, even though it's quite short, I think it's nice. It's touching. I think it has some atmosphere to it. Just the imagery of the Doctor walking calmly through a giant garden of rose bushes. I mean, it just sounds peaceful. It sounds nice. Sounds melancholic, and I think that's how it plays out too. I think it's well written, and again, I think it gets the Doctor's personality down pretty good. His sort of arrogant justifications. I don't know. I just think it's well written. And certainly if you're a fan of William Hartnett's portrayal of the Doctor, I think this is a story well worth reading, despite the fact it might look a little, I don't know, because it's just a single page story, it might strike you as irrelevant to read, but I think it has some character to it.
Yeah, I mean, you might say from some of the things we've said that the story is out of date. And yeah, you can tell this is one of those older bits of Doctor Who media. Because one, a lot of stories nowadays, and that's its big thing, is what prose stories are even being written about the old Doctors? How? What prose stories are being written about the new Doctors? The new series Adventures books, which used to be so common, only get published maybe 3 a year. I think the 13th Doctor literally only had 3 or 4 books in the new series Adventures, when the 10th Doctor and the 9th Doctor, and even the 11th Doctor have so many. So it is certainly a dated thing to read this and really any of the other Brief Encounters, but I find the Brief Encounters to be, in a way, a love letter to the classic series. Because keep in mind, these were all written in the Wilderness years before even the movie had been announced, and certainly before it had been released. So they didn't know that Doctor Who was ever going to be coming back, and to be fair, even after the movie, they didn't know it would be coming back. So many of these, like I said, they have to do with past Doctors meeting companions they wouldn't usually meet, or meeting them out of order, or meeting them way later. And all of it is, in essence, self-referential to the classic series. And some would wonder what the point then is of reading something so ancient and so, in many ways, dependent upon something else that maybe they also haven't seen. Like, if you haven't seen the Dalek invasion of Earth, maybe if you haven't even seen the Dalek's Master Plan, this story wouldn't mean as much. This story probably doesn't mean as much to my brother or I because we haven't listened to the Dalek's Master Plan. It's one of those things that we just haven't gotten to yet. And I'm sure if we had read the events that he had to go through, the tragedy at the time when he lost his companions, that perhaps this story would even hit us in a different way. But we haven't. But nonetheless, even without that, I still find the story a rather emotional time where we have this, being a Time Lord or not, he's an old man going through a rose field trying to justify his actions and face the eternal issues he's being conflicted over. I find that a page of a good characterized first actor. It's a great encapsulation of his character. And on the whole, even though it's just a very small, brief 5 minutes into the Doctor's life, I find it a story worth reading, especially if you're a fan of the first Doctor. And certainly more worth reading than Doctor Who and the Horror of Coal Hill.
But that's just our thoughts. So let us know what you thought about this one, or if you haven't read it, then let us know. But yeah, you can let us know either down below here on YouTube or on Twitter at Brothers Mahoney. But I guess wrapping up this one, what do we have coming up next, James?
Next up, we are discussing the 2005 Doctor Who Christmas Past, so the Christmas Invasion, the first full episode of David Tennant as the 10th Doctor. We, of course, last saw David Tennant in the Born Again Children in Need sort, but that was just 5 minutes of just him and Rose. So this is a nice full story with a huge cast of with a moderate cast of characters. Some great faces return from the last season, and I think it deals with a new regeneration in a really good way. It's not the same way the 11th Hour does it, but it's kind of nice to have this type of variety. This is a more Castrovalva-esque regeneration, where the Doctor is just, he just needs time to heal. Like, even in Spare from Space, yeah, he took an episode, but by episode 2 he was up and about, stealing clothes from a hospital and stealing a cow, so it's not quite the same this time around. But we would see that all with the joys of the Christmas Invasion, which will most likely be seen after the next episode of the present day Doctor Who. Next one at the time of this recording being The Wall, which also looks exciting. So, hey, Christmas Invasion, The Wall, maybe watch them the same day. Who knows? We will see.
Yeah, and it's been a while since I've seen the Christmas Invasion, so yeah, I think it's going to be fun. But yeah, that's all we have. I guess any final thoughts, James?
Not really. Like stated previously, this is just one page. You can literally find it on the blog of the writer himself, and just take a gander at it. It's going to feel dated, but that's, I think, part of the charm of the brief encounters and really the 90s and 80s Doctor Who magazine's choice as a whole. The dated feel when it was based on the classic series, because that's what they had to base it on. So just go take a look at it. I think it's a great internal monologue, basically, for the first Doctor, and I think it's well worth a read.
And yeah, I feel the same way largely. Why not? I guess it just comes down to that. If you like Doctor Who, why not read a one-page story? But yeah, that's all we have. Thanks for listening. As always, this has been Michael.
And I've been James.
You've been enjoying dulcet sound of the Brothers Mahoney. Signing off.